Good morning, everybody. My name is John O'Connell. I'm chairman of ScaleUp Group, and I'm delighted to welcome you this bright and sunny morning here in London. Hopefully it's the same wherever you are in the UK or around the world. This morning, we've got a tremendous lineup for our agenda, but before doing that, there's the obligatory listen to us but don't believe a word we say type disclaimer. Sorry about that. You'll see that we have Trevor Hope, who's a partner of Mobeus Equity Partners. If Trevor wants to just put his hand up for a second, please. And then Richard Jeffrey, who's CEO, co-founder of ActiveOps, who had the enormous pleasure of me being his first chairman for a number of years. And I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment if and when Richard feels to share his warts and all the experiences of that particular time. The session is designed to last no more than the hour, so we're finished strictly at 10. Let that not inhibit you in terms of questions. Even if we don't get round to answering them all, we definitely will follow up afterwards. So you can safely assume next sessions, wherever you have them, we'll start straight after 10. Quick word about myself. I'm perhaps best known for having founded and led onto the UK Stock Exchange, a company called Staffo PLC, which is business process management, and we sold, having been acquired by Tibco 2004 for around 200 million. And then I went into, a bit like Picasso, my startup period, which is great fun. Not that rewarding financially, but very stimulating, with working with startups, as it implies. And then I decided to kind of slightly later stage, but still early stage businesses led by entrepreneurs, working closely with the VCTs typically to help them grow that business. And in each case, I personally invested as well as went on their board, and also one or two other listed businesses as well. Then I founded ScaleUp Group, thinking that there must be lots of other people around who want to add something back, want to keep relevant. And ScaleUp Group, as you'll see, is now fully formed and consists of, in fact, 28 members, of which 22 have been former CEOs, entrepreneurs who've been through the process, personally invest in our clients' businesses, and provide ongoing support for the duration of your journey. So, we're more than just simply a glorified dating agency helping tech entrepreneurs to find their first serious fundraise through Series A. We actually are highly supportive in a practical sense throughout, and time doesn't permit us to go into too much detail, but just please accept that on board. We've raised about £30 million of growth capital for our clients, and personally we've invested over £1 million. The next slide, and I expect you to read all 33 items on that slide, and I'll be testing you shortly, really is what encapsulates what we do for our clients. Part A is how to get the money, and some of those items there you might be able to read cover how to get qualified for EIS or not. And secondly, what to do with it, which arguably is rather more important. Spending money, which was in short supply before you raised it, spending it wisely, which it inevitably means to do with building up an organization, hiring people, is not the easiest thing in the world. And there's many missteps which can happen, and members of ScaleUp Group have probably made them all. So wherever we can, we try to encapsulate this knowledge experience, and in part through this from the CEO Forum, which was an entity we've set up consisting of CEOs of our clients, and we discuss matters of interest which they raise with us. And we encapsulate those in these documents, which you see in part B, ranging from organization structures, where we should be paying yourselves, option plans, where you should be paying salespeople, how to hire them, how to induct them, so on and so forth. So the nuts and bolts of how to grow a successful business. Now, ScaleUp Group exists really to help companies grow and grow as quickly as they can. The starting point inevitably is help you get the cash you need. And we focus on Series A, which is the most demanding transition I detect, when typically entrepreneurs such as yourselves will be moving from friends and family and seed rounds, maybe crowdfunding, to suddenly being faced by these horrible, mean, challenging, oh, sorry, Trevor, funds who really want to know an awful lot about your business. In fact, as time goes on, virtually everything about your business, and apparently don't take anything on trust. Now, of course, they do take on trust, but they've got their own investors' cash to safeguard, and they do a very thorough due diligence, as they should. However, the fund's perspective, and this is based upon feedback of a survey we did in January of this year, was that it's relatively easy to get a meeting with a fund. You know, 6 out of 10 entrepreneurs typically get a meeting. Then there's a dropout, as you can see, when we get down to 1 in 4 actually gets some follow-on from that first meeting, and a mere 2%, and I've been generous in rounding up some of these numbers, by the way, actually get a term sheet, which is the formal offer of investment, and then half of those actually end up getting the money from any one fund. Now, you might think this is awful. Actually, I agree with you, it is awful. A number of reasons for that, one of which is that, putting it bluntly, and I'm sure Trevor will deny this, funds do use these meetings to find out what's really going on currently in the marketplace in different sectors. It's quite a useful source of market research for them. Another one, and this is a little bit of self-serving here, is frankly, many entrepreneurs have got no idea what is expected of them, and walk into a meeting doing a glorified product sales pitch, which is not what funds are looking for. And so we end up with a rather horrible mismatch. So by way of compensation, and I speak from personal experience, having once been congratulated on holding the world record for refusals from funds, which I'm not particularly proud of, the entrepreneur actually goes through multiple meetings, often meeting people who've got no real interest in putting money into them for multiple reasons, nothing to do with them, but check size is wrong stage of business, too small, too big, doesn't qualify for EIS, etc., etc., etc. Some of which can be easily found out in advance, but the entrepreneur tends to find out through trial and error. So they end up, as you can see from the stat down the bottom, with pretty horrible conversion rates, but at least not quite the 1% as you see. Now, the numbers down the bottom here, I literally last night I got the latest figures for Q1 of this year, and there's not much difference. The 12 months rolling figures still come to about 150 deals in Series A. Interestingly enough, split almost equally, 1/3 up to £5 million, 1/3 5 to 10, and another third over 10, which is surprising for Series A. So the average amount of money raised for any one entrepreneur in a Series A is about £7 million now. But ScaleUp Group tends to focus on the 2 to 3 million to 5 million range, which is often the time when the entrepreneur is making a transition in their own business. But you know, the figure 1.1 billion is also the current 12-month rolling figure. So substantial amount of money, and that's about 10% of the total venture funding which has been raised in the UK this last 12 months. So it's a substantial part, but also suffice to say, if you get through Series A successfully, there's every chance that there'll be more funding available to you, if you need it, of course, later. In fact, you're doing the maths, you could say there's another £9 billion available if you're really up for it. So there's no lack of cash, but lack of preparation. is and qualification is really super important to avoid you wasting time and giving up through frustration. Now, the purpose of the session this morning, since we're looking at 4 minutes left for me, is looking at the board structures. We did a survey of 30 funds last few weeks, and I'm going to whip through these slides. If you want to know more in depth, I'm also running a webinar session for the Chairman's Network at 10 to 12 today, when I'll be slightly more provocative, accusing many of them of not delivering. So that there ought to be sparks flying on this particular session later on. But you can see this is what the funds have told us. This board size typically 5 to 6, split more or less equally between execs and non-execs. It always has a CEO, always has a CFO, always has a chairman and an investment director. You may get observers from funds, and Trevor might speak to this. And sometimes the head of sales, head of ops, and there might be an independent NED as well. You can see some of the comments here, which I think speak for themselves. This came from volunteered by various funds. And also I've merged some of the comments from the CEO forum, which I thought some of you would relate more to. Second point in the middle, the fees, the average 33k, but you know, averages of course are deceptive. That includes some outliers. If you're looking for an experienced chairman, normally you're going to be paying in the 30 to 40 or 50 per annum range. It rather, of course, depends on how much time you expect of them. And one thing I'm particularly strong on is that I think chairmen should have some skin in the game, and they should be investing. And the sense we got back from the funds is that about a year's of fees is kind of the norm, makes it real. And also there's a very nice symmetry when it comes to cash flow, as the first year the chairman should be paying for themselves. On the right here, the priorities, funds really say it splits between how we're doing now, current trading performance, and how does the longer term strategy look relative to the current trading performance. And of course, there is a trade-off between one and the other. But as you'd expect, that 50-50 split. Somewhat cynically, the middle comment about if you ask the board to discuss, the salaries of salespeople, then that's what they'll be discussing. Even though afterwards you think, well, why do I bother with that? So getting the board the right level of information is absolutely vital. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of opinions, not much in the way of fact-based comments. 100% satisfaction, apparently, amongst the funds, but a couple of comments which rather tell you otherwise. So the characteristics of a chairman, I know Trevor is definitely going to comment on that, as no doubt Richard will. So I won't go too far with those. But this is according to Spectrum, a search fund, where they say basically CEOs tend to pick people they like first and seem to not focus so much on previous experience and appropriateness of their knowledge, which is a bit of a surprise. So surprise also, this is Spectrum's opinion, when they claim that CEOs aren't entirely satisfied with the performance of chairman, even though apparently funds are. So there's a mismatch there for you to think about. And then the comments from our CEOs, some look a bit harsh, and I must confess I might have made them sound a bit harsher for the purpose of getting your juices flowing this morning. There is a terrible tendency to have a permanent chairman for the rest of their days, and that can be a bit awkward frankly, for everybody. So I do suggest you put in a fixed term, even if you mutually renew. Avoid the embarrassment of trying to fire a chairman and explain why it's no longer relevant to be talking about a £10,000 level of expenditure when your revenues are hitting 10, 15, 20 million pounds. So the ability, and I found the ability of chairman to scale up is an obvious one. It also is a challenge, in my experience, of chairman scaling down to actually understand what's going on in the business at a certain level if they've been running or sitting on a board of a public company, for instance. So whilst apparently chairmen are good people, says he pleadingly, it's not always the case. So without further ado, Trevor, hopefully I've given you enough comments to rebut at your leisure. Over to Trevor Hope, who's a partner of Mobeus Equity Partners.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to ScaleUp Group for inviting me today. John, we sort of share a board with one of our investee companies, and glad to see that you sort of kept to your timing. One of the key roles of being a chairman is the timing, and you just slightly over your 15 minutes, so showing your skill set from the very beginning. Just in terms of today, I was going to give you a quick sort of introduction to Mobeus Equity Partners and my background, just to give some sort of context to my and our opinions. So Mobeus Equity Partners is not a huge firm, but sort of a mid-sized firm, has about £550 million under funds managed. We have two parts to our business. One is a buyout sort of funding business, which is change of ownership. And the other part is the growth practice, which is the part that I run. We have about £350 million, which we've invested and have cash. So we have probably now about £120 million worth of cash, and the remainder has been invested in about 40 companies, which are currently within our portfolio. And we are managing VCT, so we go out and normally sort of raise funds on an annual or biannual basis for further investments into companies. In terms of our investments, on the growth side, we normally invest up to about £5 million. The areas that we're looking for, or stage that we're looking for, is usually sort of late seed stage and then Series A and beyond. So very much in the context of the work that ScaleUp Group does with its companies and partners. I've personally been investing for over 25 years now, and I've had the pleasure of serving on multiple sort of investee company boards as an investor director. So let's get to the topic of the day. If we can move on, please. So do we need a board? My context in terms of the way that I'll be discussing it is very much around the factors which to influence, and that's because I start from the position of the board is incredibly important, not as important as getting the executive team right, but just shortly after that, you would say that the board is the next key thing in terms of a sort of people structure. And that's because when a company is going through sort of development and sort of changing and expanding, it needs all the help that it can get. And of course, you need sort of a high quality executive team, but the board has a particular role in terms of providing, fundamentally for me at least, in providing the sort of environment to allow the executive team to really sort of to develop and to do well in creating sort of value. So if they're doing their job correctly, the executive team should be in the best position to really sort of push on and move the business forward. So when we think about the board structure, we look at sort of the skill sets which are existing within a board when we're looking at a new investee company, and we think about sort of how that's come together and also what skills and experience they provide. We also think about sort of development of that board moving forward. And so when I'm sort of describing these elements, the way that it should be thought about is do the board members that you will have appointed to your companies or are about to appoint to their companies, do they have sort of experience and skill sets around these areas which will help the board to function properly, but also be sort of very positive and productive for the company as a whole. And I'd start with involving on that basis. Companies, we'll come on to sort of, I guess, an example template of how we think about boards, but there is no sort of perfect structure, I would suggest, because companies will be at different stages. They'll have different needs and requirements in those stages, and the board should try and reflect that, in fact, sort of try and anticipate it and evolve ahead of those requirements rather than behind them. So what we normally find is when we sort of invest in, particularly in sort of late stage, seed stage investments, we may well find that the board has been created on the back of who was actually in the room when they need to do the director's submission forms to Companies House. That's the thinking behind it. And then those people have been added to the board, or it could well be, and understandably so, reflecting who the owners of the company are, and they've been appointed to the board. And that may well be absolutely sort of spot on for the early stages, but as the company develops, you need to find sort of people with experience and capabilities which can really help the company in moving forward. And I think we probably have all experienced sort of members who are on the board who've historically been put onto a board of a company, and then actually they don't enjoy it. They don't feel that they add anything to it. They usually grumble about the fact that it's a waste of a few hours of their day, and they'd rather be doing operational stuff. And I think it's sort of important that you sort of consider that as the company's evolving, that some people's best output and usefulness may well not be on the board level. It may well be that they're elsewhere, but they obviously sort of that needs to be managed carefully and sort of sensitively in terms of the company developing through its stages of growth. With that in mind, in terms of evolving, when we sort of get to a company, usually about the Series A stage, I'm sort of very much in line with the ScaleUp Group survey in terms of what that looks like from a balance and structure perspective. I'd probably suggest that sort of 5 or 6 members is probably about right from my experience in terms of company board. And, you know, with the chairman, who could be executive or non-executive, and sort of, you know, executive effectively being just, you know, involved on a more sort of substantial basis, might be required from a company, or a non-executive, which will be a little bit more sort of not hands-off at all, but sort of perhaps less days a week actually being involved with the company. So when we think about executive, we're probably thinking sort of two days per week or something like that in terms of being involved with a company. And we think about non-executive, we're probably thinking about three or four days per month in terms of being involved with the company. Now, that doesn't mean that they have a strict sort of calendar. We find that what usually works best is, of course, have a board meeting in terms of the chairman being involved, as an example. But beyond there, they'll be on hand to sort of coach sort of executives and the like, and provide sort of greater input as required. But in terms of balance and structure, 5 or 6 is usually about the right number, the chairman, and then we would sort of have a split between the executive and the non-executives. And we think that's important because, coming on to the next part, strategic and not operational, a key part for the thinking is that the board should be thinking about, you know, looking up from the trenches as such and being strategic in their thinking and not operational. One of the things which we find with executive teams is sometimes when they don't feel the board is working effectively, it's because it's becoming a sort of a 100% reporting shop. Of course, the board needs information regarding what's going on with the business, and that should be provided in the board pack and in sort of summary reports within the meeting. But that shouldn't be the focus where you get pulled into, the board gets pulled into the minutiae and detail of operations. Yes, they need to understand it, but they should be thinking about sort of the actual, what is that sort of performance and results and actions taken, what is actually done to the business, and what needs to be done in terms of changing and moving the business forward, and having that debate and discussion with the executive team and the wider board, rather than getting into the minutiae, which will be what the executive team will be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I think you're getting it wrong if the executive team feel that they're just coming into the board meeting just to repeat everything that they already know and then to leave sort of empty-handed without any views or advice or suggestions. So that's a key point in terms of board functioning. In terms of the stakeholders, in terms of who should be represented, so there are obviously sort of various shareholders who are represented within a sort of company shareholder base, investors, their employees, and sort of other sort of stakeholder groups. I think what you really should try to achieve is naturally within that board selection, an element of those stakeholder representation, if at all possible. So with the executive team, you'll have directors and hopefully employee representation to a greater extent. With regard to sort of chairmen and the like, it may well be, as John mentioned, they've invested into the company, so a shareholder, which is great. You then, of course, from our perspective as an investor, we like to be on the boards in terms of, one, hoping that we can add value regarding sort of the board and the company, but also as a representative of our investors into that company, so that we can sort of, you know, to be clear, an observation of what's going on, but also in terms of being able to help the company, and also be ready in terms of if the company needs further funding and finance or assistance in other areas where we may have experience. Up to the top of the slide in terms of structure, this is slightly different to the balance and structure element, and this is really around when you're looking at candidates, and particularly with regard to a chairman, which I'll come on to a little bit more detail in the next slide, you're really looking at sort of providing a governance structure and also an organisational structure to the board, which then hopefully flows through the wider organisation. So in terms of reporting, in terms of information, in terms of governance, in terms of communication to the wider company, to stakeholders, the board should be able to provide that sort of structure to allow that to happen naturally and effectively in a timely fashion. So I think that's important when you think about sort of skill sets in terms of appointments. And it's one of the things whereby, from an experience perspective, it's one of the things that you sort of learn becoming on boards, and sort of an experienced chairman will have this down pat in terms of how you structure board meetings, the expectation that actually you'll be receiving board packs in advance of those meetings, that everyone is well informed before they get into the room, and in terms of just managing the conduct of a meeting, you know, keeping it timely, keeping to the agenda points, ensuring that people sort of get fair sort of space in terms of communicating views and opinions. So that's actually quite hard to do, and it takes a bit of practice and experience. And therefore, if you can get a chairman who's done it before, it's usually very helpful. You can also find sort of very experienced non-executive directors who've done set on boards. They're trying to pick up skills and sort of ways of doing things from other chairmen, and then they can sort of move on to that role at a later stage. The point regarding being decisive, I think this comes back to the strategy point, and in terms of leadership, it's incredibly important. And my experience working with a number of CEOs is they come to the board, and it should be a time where they can actually report, but it's not a sort of coming up to the headmaster's office, whereby they're actually sort of just giving hopefully a positive outlook and trying to sort of make the problem go away. It should be sort of an open sort of dialogue in terms of working with the board to ensure that the wider board can give opinions, suggestions and ideas, and as a group you can make decisions. It's important that you don't just allow that conversation to keep going on and sort of looking for further data. The help and assistance that's required is to really give clear direction to the executive team and with the executive team to ensure that the company is not in sort of a grey area in terms of what it's trying to achieve and how it's going to go about doing that. So I guess in terms of I picked out some of the points there in terms of the executive, and I didn't want to sort of labour it too far, but I guess if you can think about candidates and the composition of a board, from an investor's perspective, that's actually key to ensuring that we feel comfortable that the board is being well run, that the company is being well run. And it's our main sort of key area in terms of way of understanding exactly where the company is in terms of its ambitions and also in terms of its performance. So for us, it's a very key area. So in answer to the question, do you need a board? If you don't have one when sort of the investor comes along, or a proper functioning one, that's going to be top of their list in terms of evolving it. And actually how you've evolved your company board before we come on board is actually one of the points that we look at in terms of the approach and attitude. And what we're really looking for is an executive team who have noticed and understood that they need sort of, you know, greater sort of advice and challenge and suggestions from a wider group, which is not just the executive team working on a day-to-day basis. Robert, can you move on to the next slide? I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I know this session is being recorded and the slides will be available. But I wanted just to pick out specifically around the chairman's role and how the sort of investor looks at it. We spend a huge amount of time in terms of understanding the chairman's role within a particular company when we're looking to invest. And I would suggest probably about 80% of the times when we make an investment, we'll probably see a change in the chairman, or we will appoint a new independent chairman to the company. And that could be just naturally that the company has moved to the next stage and it needs a different type of chairman. The previous chairman may well have been family or friends, or sort of a contact, as John mentioned, sort of a friend of the CEO rather than what we would perhaps consider a professional chairman or a chairman with experience. That chairman, you know, hopefully will have experience in terms of the sector, but also in terms of the stage of development that the company is at. So we will normally and naturally think about appointing a new chairman. We do that in connection with the executive team. We want to find the right people. We know that the sort of synergies and the sort of relationships need to be right. So we don't, you know, we may well put forward candidates, but we want the executive team, and particularly the CEO, to feel comfortable with that appointment and see the value in making that appointment. And then we go through a process which is very much around what we expect that chairman's role to be. Now, in a lot of cases, there's a huge amount of experience already from that chairman, and they'll understand what's expected of them in terms of responsibility. But what I've got here in terms of these slides are just a a formal sort of communication that we have with chairman in terms of what we're expecting from them. And if you sort of read through that in terms of the overview and sort of description, we can then move on to the 4 key objectives, which the chairman is really leading the board in doing, which is the next slide. As I said, I'm not going to walk through these, but I guess I just wanted to point out the chairman in terms of leading the board, and therefore in terms of influencing and helping the executive team focus on strategy. That's sort of looking out from the trenches, keeping sort of, looking at the horizon, understanding and anticipating what the company needs to be doing and moving forward in terms of achieving its goals. Obviously monitoring performance in terms of the board packs and the like, ensuring that we're getting right and correct information so that the board can make the right decisions based upon sort of useful information. In terms of resources, absolutely key. Having the right people in the right place, and also planning in terms of succession or in terms of development, that should be sort of top of the agenda in terms of the way that the board thinks about its purpose and how it works. And then of course risk, in terms of understanding where the company is, but also communicating that risk element to shareholders and keeping them up to date in terms of how the business is doing, what might be required going forward, and sort of ensuring that sort of there are effective controls in place to assess and manage risk so the company isn't caught out in any way. So I'll leave you with those slides because time is moving on, but I just really wanted to give you a specific view of regarding a chairman, and hopefully sort of provide you a little bit more context regarding how investors think about that wider context of a board development and sort of who should be on boards and how they should be structured. So hopefully that was helpful. And now I'm going to pass on to Richard in terms of his experience.
Thank you, Trevor. And again, good morning, everyone. So building on John and Trevor's commentary there, I'm just going to give you a bit of a perspective of what it's been like for me in this particular journey so far. And I think perhaps I start with the sort of key point for me is how the role and contribution of a board adapts and changes depending on effectively the situation and the needs of the business. And when I reflect back, which preparing for this discussion caused me to do, it did make me appreciate perhaps how much it has the role and purpose of the board for me or for our company has evolved over that time. So if you could, so in terms of just a little bit of background on ActiveOps, we provide management process automation software. It's a SaaS software business, recurrent revenues and that kind of sort of commercial model. And in particular, we address the challenge for large organizations where our customers are banks, insurance companies, people for whom business processes that they support for customers are in that sort of people notice when they break type situation, credit cards, transactions, ATM machines that don't give out money and so on, they matter. So orchestrating and making sure they're up and operational is a huge challenge. And in that world, it's interesting in how the pace of change, whether it's robotics, whether it's compliance, whether it's regulatory oversight, as you can imagine, that the actual nature of what being in control includes or requires is changing out of all proportion. I mean, how you control robots which are interacting to deliver services that previously a lot more human interaction involved creates both huge efficiencies but also huge opportunities for break and damage and reputational risk. So in some ways it's a bit like sort of the journey for these organizations, a bit like the journey in the sort of late 19th century when people were running railways. They were pulling levers and doing that sort of stuff, whereas today of course we have people near Didcot sort of orchestrating the entire network with much more complexity, a huge amount more traffic and a lot less people. And so our world is basically providing that kind of upgrade. So in context of the discussion about what does the board do for us, the next slide, it shows really the fact that as like any business, it's all about the context. And this was a slide we produced just to show our journey for our sort of leading up to the IPO recently. And I think it just lays out just the sort of the story. And it's not exactly an overnight success, but what that does mean, as we came to requiring a board, it fitted into the situation we were in. So if you there's some key points called out there where we were first of all started as a partnership, then we became a sort of separate organization, and ultimately we took some finance, but along the way we deployed in South Africa and Australia and a variety of other locations, which introduces complexity. So by the time you get to a certain stage, the sort of model of control you might have in your business, which is sort of sufficient to purpose at that moment, suddenly effectively becomes obsolete. So if you go on a slide, please, you can see how over that time, and the red is where we effectively created a board. The initial stage for myself and my co-founder was we were effectively a sort of a subdivision within a broader partnership of which we were a partner. You know, pain in the arse, oversight and control in some ways, but fundamentally it was a bunch of people doing stuff. Then we external, you know, we took ourselves out. Then we had shadow partners, but we were running our own shop. But we had to sort of manage within that constraints. Within, you know, the business gets bigger and more complex. The key point, though, in terms of the triggering the requirement for a board was exactly to John and to Trevor's sort of intro, was when we took some private investment. In 2014, we took a minority interest from an EIS investor, Calculus, and at the same time converted from becoming a limited liability partnership to a limited company. And I think I do remember that whole sort of, it was very much that sort of nervousness about what would it bring. I was used to, myself and my co-founder, you know, winging it, making it up as we went along, all that stuff, but fundamentally, you know, recognizing the value of internal protocols and disciplines, which we probably hadn't got as much of as we needed. I had already brought in a more experienced, I would say, than me, COO type role, and he had, in lead up to taking the Calculus investment, had done a great job to effectively bring a lot of the order and structure. So we didn't go in to a kind of new world without a lot of good internal management process, but we didn't actually have a formality of a board structure. So the 2014 piece for me was key, because then that required us. We had so to give you the composition, we had the investment director who'd led the decision to invest in us. John joined the team as our new chairman, alongside one other non-exec director. But the rest of the board, we actually had quite a big board in terms of the executives on the team. So we had 4 members of myself and 3 others in terms of actually on the directors board. And what that meant in that first red blob phase of the business was it was very operational, because there was a huge amount of value. If you could go on a slide to the, you know, in terms of actually what it did for us in the best Monty Python-esque what did the Romans ever do for us context. And if you could go on, there's a kind of sort of an overt bit, and then there's the sort of the bit under the water bit of the iceberg there. For my team at that time, bringing on people that had scaled a business, to use John's type of phrasing, had worked in large corporations. The non-exec director in particular came in from large corporations we were selling to, so understood the psyche of that type of stuff. Plus the investment director, in terms of his own portfolio of other companies and boards he sat on, that was I could be really polite and say a treasure trove. I mean, there's lots of gold in the hills. You just got to dig for it at times. There was an awful lot of experience in that to help my team. So in that first phase, particularly 2014 to 17, the board was very, very executive. John, as everyone probably knows who knows him, was never shy of coming forward with an opinion. Interestingly, you know, we talked about data, because very often, despite the data, John would still have his opinion. Thank you, John. But counterbalancing that, the exec director from Calculus was incredibly structured and required an awful lot of data and required us to perform. So that kind of was why we had a very, I think we got a lot of value from bringing an awful, you know, a serious amount of relatively operational discussions into that team. And I do take the points that we made earlier about that balance between operational and strategic. But I think we needed that help to become a lot more sort of operationally secure, I suppose. So on the left there, you've got that kind of the rigor of governance and just putting some structure to it. The accountability of my team, knowing that there was a process once a month or whatever when they would stand and be talking to things that either had been achieved or were going to be achieved. That was just a healthy discipline. The associated mechanics, which we were a bit light on. There's obviously the sort of record keeping bit, which, like any business, is a bit partial at times. And I think those are the sort of the key things. But there's a more sort of, there was a different piece to it, which is sort of under the iceberg. I wouldn't necessarily appreciate it beforehand, but what it meant, I think, firstly, for the whole business, is there was a kind of if I said a rather sort of abstract reference point of, oh, you know, the board ... and that's not a sort of substitute for authority, but it did mean it was like, you know, there was always your you know, grandparents over the shoulder wanting to know what, not wanting to go, to which we felt we had to be doing the right thing for. I mean, and it was far more a mental model than anything in reality, but I think it helped the maturing of the business around the world, actually, knowing that we had that kind of structure in place. The second point, I think personally, as a sort of, you know, accidental CEO like most of us, the coaching aspect from the access to different people on a one-to-one basis, I found immensely helpful. But also other members of my senior management team who took advantage of individual roles within the board to develop relationships and be specifically coached in certain aspects of sales and a variety of other things, which I hadn't really anticipated, but in hindsight was a massive thing. And I think, again, and I guess this must be part of the nature of the relationships you have on the board. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But what I also recognize in hindsight is it does make a big difference in terms of some of the burden of being an entrepreneur, the founder, you know, that carrying that responsibility to increasingly a larger, if you're a growing company, and large number of people's, you know, homes, houses, well-being, and mortgages, is just, the board itself provides a kind of collective accountability sort of burden share, which doesn't mean you aren't responsible as the CEO, but fundamentally, I think, altered that sense of more collective, you know, if you're making some big calls, and over time we did make some big calls involving people's livelihoods, it does change the dynamic of it. I mean, you're still personally accountable and you're still the face of your company and certainly to your individuals, but it definitely made a difference to me in terms of how I felt about some of the decisions we were making. Just to talk to the migration, we then, I think, as the trust, combination of trust, effectiveness, and teamwork, and there's a real aspect of team working as a board, you know, really do recognize that capability. As people's roles become firmer, then it steps, what I then found, it sort of stepped up a gear because the operational running was then more secure. But so as we then looked into the sort of the exit strategy, because the other dynamic here is that you've got to recognize, and you know, Trevor will know all about this, is the motivations for membership of the board do evolve over time. So you get to a point where some of those stakeholders absolutely need their money back if you've got some investment. So you start getting that divergence, or let's not diversion necessarily, but you've got to work quite hard to keep alignment of interest between the different members of the board, because that's when things get really shitty. In terms of the sort of when people are playing to really different agendas, that doesn't work well. I think John could probably tell more stories about that experience than I. We were very lucky in that respect. But as we moved into that end game, then it was much more about managing to sort of the priorities of exit, shareholder value, and all the other kind of things, rather than just make the business good, which is probably the first phase. So as you moved in that second phase, it became less operational, it became more strategic, and it became much more about delivering a particular sort of almost project-like objectives, which was you know, a step on. I think it's worth also touching on the next transition, which is, as we've known from being a private company to most recently a public company, the role of the board, as for me, shifted again, because now we don't have that kind of investment director with a significant sort of, and there was a different dynamic, which is the investment director, by the way, on your board has a number of reserve matters. So even inside our own board, there were things that effectively we'd like to do, but they had to go back to their sort of, even as a minority holder, go back to their internal investment committee and say, are we okay with this? And that is worth more discussion on a different occasion, perhaps. But that, or I can expand on that, but that meant that even our own board had a kind of a parent somewhere in the background that was checking over things. But the new board, it's really interesting because we're just making the transition as we speak, really, and it is now much more about governance and, you know, compliance and much less operational. And so again, I'm just struck by the evolution of the role of the board. If we can just go on to the last slide here. So I mean, there is no question in my mind that having a board structure in itself took us on a level. You then get to the people on the board, and John was a fabulous chairman for us. and then subsequently, to his point exactly, there was a natural term to these things, and you have a change of board of chairman. But it fundamentally did drive the performance of the business in all sorts of ways, both specifically because of the individual skills, but as a principle really of just maturity. It does adapt, and I think it's a mistake to not to recognise that. And then back to the sort of point, really, I think I've been quite lucky. I do hear horrendous experiences of, let's say, diverging interests and competing objectives, but fundamentally, I think it's so important about that kind of, you have to have trust. You don't necessarily need to like. I don't mean I didn't like, I'm just saying that isn't it, but you have to have trust in the kind of the motivations and the respect, let's say, or for the dignity of people's roles on there, and play to that accordingly, because people's it does make a massive difference when you need to be able to rely on each other in that context. So in our own experience, we definitely had our ding-dong moments, but fundamentally it was underpinned by a belief in both the business itself, but the kind of integrity of the individuals on it. So then you're back to that personal chemistry point. I completely agree with some of the comments earlier on that I think it is a mistake if it's based on just a bunch of mates, because you're doing yourselves no favors. Equally, if you start with some established relationships, then clearly that helps, if you like, get to perhaps being more honest in the early stages. So there's a kind of interesting finesse there. So, it's been a process, and there was no grand plan, but certainly in the context of that kind of inflection point when you decide, do I want to put up with the theoretically, the oversight of having formal board structure? In my case, without a shadow of doubt, it has made and continues to make a big difference to the way in which both we run the business, but also just how sort of in control I feel in an entirely positive way. So that's me, but I'm very happy to, in fact, probably more interesting to take questions. So thank you, John. Thank you, Trevor. Back to you.
John, you're on mute.
Thanks, Trevor. Barbara, I assume you're going to run these slides. Thanks so much, Richard. That's interesting to hear it from your perspective after a period of reflection. What's some of the thoughts that struck me as you were talking? Because first of all, a chairman, I think, needs to be something of a chameleon, where you adapt your style to suit, especially the CEO, founder, but also the other members of the board, and also the fund, and putting it kind of in stark terms. If you've got a CEO who's a little, so to say, timid, which has rarely been my experience, I have to say, then you tend to have to supplement it with your ambition, trying to make them less timid, more aggressive, more expansionist, or probably more likely to think they can do more. Actually, sometimes in the UK, we're very guilty of being modest, and we don't really shoot for the stars. We know the reverse is the case with our North American cousins, that they will talk about world domination day after tomorrow. But somewhere between the two, I would suggest, is a reasonable balance. So sometimes the chairman has to be the one who kind of thinks of the bigger picture, or often, regrettably, to try and restrain a gung-ho CEO founder who's never done it before, and now has got millions of pounds of money in the bank, and thinks they just spend it, willy-nilly. And that restraint part is not a very inspiring one, typically for people like me, because we'd far rather be at the creative end. I think the other angle, which Richard brought out extremely well, is the balance of skills and attitude around the table. Given that we had in two non-execs, the investor director and the other non-exec, quite structured types of people, then it frankly allowed me a bit more of the luxury to be a bit more deliberately freewheeling. as a balance between that. And sometimes I would, you know, deliberately provocative to get a bit of passion going in the room. But most importantly, I think, is that right at the beginning, and hopefully Richard won't mind me saying this, you know, the fund had bought in on one proposition by way of a strategy going forward to scale up. And it quickly became obvious to us all that that wasn't a strategy which was really going to be effective, and didn't suit the company, and wasn't evolution. It was something of a leap in the dark. And quickly, all the board agreed that we should modify that strategy to a different approach. And that was very helpful, actually, because it meant right at the beginning, this new board, you know, once we knocked this about and debated it and blah, 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 this new board was aligned as to what the strategy was, you know. And this came up the other day in CEO Forum when someone said, well, oh, do you actually sit down with the board members and actually agree what the strategy and objectives are? I say, well, if you don't do it at the beginning, you know, where are you? What are you trying to achieve? All this governance stuff and this, you know, approvals, but what's the context of the whole thing? So if you haven't got an alignment of interest, and fundamentally things like, well, if you've got shareholders, be it funds, who say, you know, we want to exit in 5 years, and your goal is to keep going for as long as possible, maybe float on the stock market, as Richard has done very successfully. You know, are you aligned?
John, just to interrupt your apologies, Rolly, I'm just conscious it was a QA session.
Yeah.
So there's a few things here, and I don't want people to be frustrated there. There's a couple of questions on there. Do you want to pick up on those?
Yeah.
I mean, there's the one that strikes the heart immediately of so many CEOs when you contemplate taking private investment. I wonder what, Trevor, your experience is in terms of have you ever had to replace a founder CEO, and what happened?
Yeah, well, that's at the heart of the matter, isn't it, Richard? In terms of the a founder sort of CEO, I think my experience has been particularly around sort of technology founders. A lot of the times they've been, you know, they sort of not fallen into sort of creating a company, but they sort of created a product or technology, built that out, found that it had sort of a market opportunity, started building the company around it, going through significant growth. And there is one element of it, which is actually their skill set and abilities may well not be suited to be a CEO, but also their preference may not to be a CEO. But sometimes it's very hard for a CEO who's now perhaps going for funding, has employees, you know, has been developing this company. There is an element of they must know all the answers, they must be up for it, they must want to be leading. And it's been a few times we've had a conversation where it's been quite clear that they're quite happy and actually willing to step back from that CEO role, but they want to make sure that the company is going to be in safe hands. They want to make sure that the alignment of interest is still there. So that has definitely happened, and it does happen. And sometimes it's the right thing to happen. And it's key part of our process as investors, understanding if there is an understanding that as a company develops, people have particular skill sets, which means that they can do certain things and be very good at doing them, but maybe not as good as others. And they need a team around them and a wider board to help them fill those gaps.
Yeah. What about you, John? Have you had to fire anyone as a board member? Firing
Yeah.
a CEO?
Yeah, quite a few. The confusion of roles is a hard one. You know, CEO is an executive role. Founder has got its own characteristics, and then you're a shareholder as well. And just because you're the founder and the possible major shareholder does not make you a good executive. And some people, you can fudge it quite often, you know, by putting in a COO who does really most of the CEO type work, and let the CEO do what they're great at, which is be a spokesperson. You know, maybe they do all the big deals, which is fine, you know, if everyone recognises that. I've had more issues with non-exec directors who hang around past their sell-by date. One of the reasons, Richard, I wanted a 2-year deal in our agreement at the beginning was I didn't want that situation to occur where they just can't move on. You know, if you're a £5 million revenue business, is one level of behaviour. If you're 20 million, it's another level, isn't it? I think getting rid of angel investors who've become non-execs is a particular pain all round.
Just again, just because there's the second question there, in conscious of time. What about the CEO being chairman? Have you, again, Trevor, would you ever recommend that, or has that ever happened?
It has happened sort of way back in my distant past. But I'm not a huge fan of it. I think if you think about the attributes that you're hoping that the chairman can bring in terms of challenge and in terms of coaching, that should be two separate sort of people. And you know, for me, it's sort of, if you've got a well-balanced CEO, they should absolutely see the value of having an additional sort of a strong and challenging chairman who's has built the sort of experience and sort of maybe industry knowledge as well to help them develop in the company. So I very much like to keep those separate. So it's happened in the past. It's not something that we would promote now going forward. Yeah,
I would certainly support that, because I mean a lot depends obviously on the dynamics of who's what and how they've got there. But I think it's the whole thing about recognizing a requirement for a different role, and that different thing. Maybe it's worked for some people, but I think it would be a missed opportunity, frankly, if to go that way. I mean, there's probably particular situations where it might work, but certainly my instinct would be to keep them wide apart. Nothing else, it just gives you somebody else to moan about.
Richard, what did you resent most about the board?
There are obviously times when you feel you're having to explain, and explaining is always a pain in the ass. So and it's legitimate, but I became resentful, particularly when you also felt it had been gone down before. So somewhere on the line you clearly got some miscommunication, because that stuff. I mean, when your chairman gets a bit elderly and you have answered the direct question in the previous meeting, he's just forgotten about it, John, that becomes irksome. But in the round, I think it's obviously the burden of accountability. But and some people, and the classic is also a level of basically different approaches. I mean, it is healthy to have someone on the board. As an entrepreneur, you can't help looking for quick fixes, rapid, cutting through. The type of person that ends up doing this kind of thing that we do is looking for, snappy solutions or whatever. And then somebody on the board, for example, maybe you've come from a large organization, is much more around process, procedure, making sure for the avoidance of doubt that we haven't messed up here. That can drive you insane. But I think, and I'm speaking personally here, you come to recognize that that's not just being bureaucratic for the sake of it. There is a balance to be struck, especially when you you get to a certain size.
Can I just say on that point, sort of, I think which is spot on in terms of the the information flow and people being prepared for board meetings and listening and understanding what the business is doing and having a real interest on it as a board member, be it sort of exec or non-exec. I think in terms, one thing I would balance it out with though is I think there are times where it's been very valuable for a board to keep asking the same question again and again, because we haven't quite got there. And it could well be something as simple as being a new product in terms of development. We're going through a long period of spending a lot of money on it. Just checking in all the time of saying, actually, what is the value in the product offering? What is the product market fit? Because a lot of times executives can perhaps get a little bit lost in terms of being in the trenches. Yeah, 100%.
Because that whole thing about you're consuming your own smoke. You're generating. That's the nature of the sort of closed circle you're in. And I think that kind of sanity test, that kind of contextual sort of light of day, holding the mirror up, whatever euphemism you want to use, is absolutely critical. There are more questions. We've hit 10, so very happy to anybody who wants to get.
So thanks for that. So in summary, back to the original point, the opening, which is, this is all part of the context of Series A. Typically, as Richard has said, you may not have had a board before, so putting together one is key. Remember, one of our speakers touched upon this, business is a team game, and the board is a member of that team, albeit at a higher level, perhaps in terms of governance and shareholder interest. Boards, as we've seen from various surveys and from what's been said this morning, usually add value, but not always. And it's important that you get the dynamics right, and it changes over time. Most importantly, the alignment of interests at the beginning. What direction are we going in, for what purpose, and what's the destination, over what time frame? And if you can't answer those simple questions around the table and you're not aligned, you're sowing the seeds of problems in due course. So that's, I would say, the most important takeaway of all as far as this morning's session is concerned. I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention. ScaleUp Group is there to help you become global champions, and I think Richard Jeffrey is a prime example of that, and to get the funds from the right sources with people who've been there before, got the experience, they've seen the tough times as well as the good times. So Mobeus clearly falls into that category of being a sensible long-term investor in such businesses. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. We've not taken any questions from the floor, but if you do have any, please do send them to us and we'll follow up in due course. And I'd like to thank finally Richard Jeffrey and Trevor Hope for what we believe should have been a stimulating session for you this morning. Thank you both. Take care.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.